In 2010, a show called The Walking Dead graced our screens about an officer named Rick Grimes trying to navigate his way through the zombie apocalypse. The show was based on a comic series of the same name, and everyone knew that Rick Grimes was going to be an incredibly difficult character to cast. He's not only the protagonist of the series, but he's a character with multiple different dimensions, making him a hero, a villain, and most of the time finding something between the two. Andrew Lincoln won the role, which was an incredibly odd choice given the fact that his biggest role before this was a rom-com, so how well could this guy do at portraying this iconic character? Well, I say iconic because Andrew Lincoln's performance as Rick Grimes cemented his place as one of the greatest characters in television history. But alas, all good things have to come to an end, kinda. So after 8 years and 122 episodes, the time came to say goodbye to Rick Grimes in the episode What Comes After. Today I'm going to be recapping What Comes After and explaining how it was the perfect send-off for Officer Friendly, the one and only Rick Grimes. Now first I have to explain what's been going on in the previous episodes, or else the recap won't make much sense. After Rick and the group have defeated Negan, Rick tries his best to build a new world of hope and strength, a world birthed out of a vision that Carl had for the future. But not everything is as easy as it sounds. There's still conflict between the communities, and Rick's decision to keep Negan alive has not been a particularly popular one. Maggie goes to kill Negan while Daryl distracts Rick, but of course they run into a horde because there always has to be a horde. Rick falls off his horse and impales himself on some rebar, and while being on the brink of death, Rick starts hallucinating. He sees dozens of helicopters flying towards him before he tells himself to wake up. So he does, seeing the horde closing in around him. Rick cleverly gets himself out of the situation and gets back on his horse, limping and bleeding profusely as he does so. Meanwhile, Jadis is trying to get away because a strange voice on the radio is trying to pick up their A. She tells the voice on the radio that she has an A and that she's ready to be evacuated, but in reality, she doesn't. Rick starts coming in and out of consciousness, knowing that he has to stay awake. In his dreamlike state, Rick starts seeing flashes of all the places that he's been. Maggie continues her way to Alexandria, stopping to get some practice on a walker before she encounters the real thing. Rick gets ahead of the horde and stops in at a broken down cabin, wrapping his wound when he starts hallucinating again, this time seeing a very old friend in Shane Walsh. Rick says that he's looking for his family, but Shane jokingly reminds him that it's actually his family that he's looking for. Rick calls him an asshole, and Shane says that he too is an asshole. Shane tells him that he's glad Rick killed him because it got him ready for the road ahead. Everything that happened after that, like the Claimers and the Terminus cannibals, came from Shane's effect, to which he takes full credit for. Rick apologizes, and Shane tells him that he needs to forget about it and dig deep to survive, and he needs to wake up. Rick listens to Shane and wakes up, finding the horde on top of him. Rick gets on his horse and escapes. Maggie arrives at Alexandria, and Michonne stands in her way. Michonne tries to sway her opinion on killing Negan, but Maggie doesn't want to listen. Michonne tells Maggie that Glenn wouldn't want her to do this, but Maggie says she doesn't know what Glenn wants because he isn't here. She goes on to tell Michonne that if it had been Rick instead of Glenn, then she would have killed Negan a long time ago. Michonne agrees with that logic and lets her through. Maggie goes in to face Negan, who sees that his time has come. He taunts her, telling her that he remembers how she screamed when he killed her husband. He also recalls the moment he popped Glenn's eye out and bashed in his skull. Maggie tells him to get on his knees, and he does so, continuing to taunt her and tell her to kill him. His voice starts breaking, and he starts crying, begging for her to kill him. He says that he wants to die so that he can be reunited with Lucille, because he can't live like this anymore. The exact same words that Maggie said to Michonne. She orders him to get back in his cell, because she knows that he's already worse than dead. Rick continues on his horse, this time hallucinating another old friend and mentor in Herschel Green. He apologizes to Herschel for everything that Maggie's lost, but Herschel tells him that Maggie's strong, and his grandson is only going to make her stronger. Herschel gives him the strength to wake up once again, only for him to fall asleep like immediately after, and see the hospital that he woke up from in the first episode. This time Rick opens the Don't Dead Open Inside door and runs into Sasha, seeing an endless sea of bodies of everyone Rick has known throughout his journey. She tells Rick that he did his part in this world, just like everyone did their part before them. She says that he doesn't have to find his family because they aren't lost. He wakes up once again, this time at the campsite. the walkers closing in around him. Rick makes a few very well-placed shots from his revolver and gets up, this time limping away from the walkers because his horse ran out on him. Rick comes to the bridge that his people built, intent on bringing the walkers over it to bring the bridge down. Just as Rick collapses, the group comes over to save him, and Rick says that he found his family. The group takes out the horde rather quickly and just kinda stands there, which is strange, but oh wait, this was just a dream. Rick stands and walks over the bridge, seeing that it's gonna hold the walkers. He starts walking away. Right as a walker is about to get him, an arrow saves him. Daryl and the group have actually arrived this time, trying to come up with an immediate plan to divert the walkers. Daryl stays put, shooting as many arrows as he can to save Rick. Rick gets in one last hatchet kill before he sees sticks of dynamite fall over onto the bridge. The group finds a way to run around the river somehow, shooting their guns to divert the walkers, but it doesn't seem to work. Officer Friendly raises his iconic gun as the group arrives on the other side. Taking one last breath, Rick says, "I found him," and shoots the dynamite. The walkers start going into the water as everyone breaks down, knowing that Rick is gone for good. Daryl walks away as Maggie and Carol try to comfort Michonne. Jadis sees the aftermath of the bridge explosion in the distance as the helicopter arrives to pick up their A. She looks at the river and notices Rick laying off the shore, alive and well. Kinda. She tells the helicopter that she actually has a B, not an A, but she asks them to save her friend. The helicopter lowers and loads Rick Grimes into the vehicle. Rick wakes for a few moments, seeing Jadis, who tells him that he's gonna be okay and he's saved. The helicopter flies away, and Rick falls back asleep. Years later, a group of survivors led by Jacob Kowalski are being surrounded when shots from a revolver make an opening in the horde. It turns out that these shots were fired by someone far too young to know how to compensate for the kick of that revolver, who says that their name is Judith Grimes. Now, this is technically the last time that we've seen Rick Grimes, and if you want to hear more about where he went, check out my CRM Explained video. I'll leave a card for it in the top right corner right now. Going into this episode, I think everyone was expecting Rick to die, so him being chartered off by helicopter was a surprise, but it also makes a great deal of sense. Rick has been seeing these helicopters throughout the series, not knowing who they were or where they were coming from. We, as audience members, had the same questions as him, to the point where a lot of people just thought Rick was hallucinating them because he's the only one who ever saw them. But now that we're getting a Rick and Michonne show, I'm sure we'll be getting much more answers next year. Anyways, there's a lot to love about this episode. Not only does it bring Rick's character arc to a close, but it also brings a close to Maggie's character arc as well, who wouldn't be back in the show after this episode until the season 10 finale. Her seeing that Negan's fate is already worse than death shows us that Maggie isn't just some revenge-driven lunatic, but she actually was just looking for justice. I think even she was surprised to see that justice didn't necessarily mean Negan's death, and because this is Rick's last episode, this moment gets overshadowed quite a bit. I also love that we got to see Rick have his last few badass moments with the revolver and the hatchet. These are two iconic weapons, and it was immensely satisfying to see Rick use them in his last moments on the show. 2/3 of Rick's flashbacks were phenomenal. With Shane, it seems Rick finally got the closure on the situation that he needed, and it was nice for the audience to hear them interact and realize that Rick and Shane did become very similar people. I have a video about how I believe Rick ultimately became worse than Shane, and that was the first ever Walking Dead video I made on this channel. People have very different opinions on that subject, but Rick's entire character arc in the show was about him going down a darker path and becoming like Shane until he saw differently. So this scene gave closure to Rick, but also to the audience as well, and it was really great to see Jon Bernthal back in the role, even if it was just for a few minutes. When Rick sees Herschel, I think it's by far the most emotional moment in the episode. Rick apologizing for everything that's happened, ultimately for Herschel to forgive him and tell him that he's done a great job as a leader, was, again, the closure that Rick needed, but the scene becomes 10 times more emotional when you realize that this was Scott Wilson's last ever role on screen before he died. He was sick and dying, but he still made this appearance, so I'm sure this hug between them is far more than Rick thanking Herschel. It's Andrew Lincoln also saying goodbye to Scott Wilson. There could not have been a better Herschel than Scott Wilson, and I hope he's resting easy.
Stefan Herschel, is that you?
Now, the third flashback to me makes very little sense. Of all the people he's encountered, of all the friendships he's made and lost, he sees Sasha. I always thought Sasha was a fine character, but I can't for the life of me remember a single meaningful scene she shared with Rick Grimes. Who should have taken her place? Oh, I don't know, maybe Rick's dead son Carl? The point of this scene was for Sasha to tell Rick that he's done more than enough for the people around him and that all of the people he's been around are his true family. That's a great message, and I guess having it come from a random person Rick met during the apocalypse makes sense, but it doesn't do anything for me emotionally. Both Shane and Herschel had massive impacts on Rick as a character, but Sasha didn't change Rick at all. It would have made far more sense for Carl to be here and tell him that he's proud of his dad for letting Negan live and building the new world. Or even for Glenn to show up and say that he's glad Rick let Negan live and decided to move on with his life. There are a few things in this episode other than the Sasha thing that also don't make a whole lot of sense to me. For one, where did this dynamite come from? Why is there dynamite on a bridge that they just recently built? I could just be misremembering things, but I don't remember this dynamite ever being discussed or talked about before this episode, so it's very random that it's here and obviously just used for plot convenience. Also, when Rick blows up the bridge, how did he get in the water? The explosion came from the middle of the bridge, and Rick was at the end of the bridge. The explosion should have sent him backwards, but somehow he got flung forwards or sideways into the water. That has always made very little sense to me, but again, I guess it's just for plot convenience. Overall, what comes after was a terrific send-off to the beloved Rick Grimes. I can't wait to see him come to our screens again in the Rick and Michonne show and see where he's been for the past 6 years. What are your thoughts on what comes after? Let me know down in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, remember to leave it a like and subscribe for more Walking Dead content. If you do, then I'll see you in the next one.